Welcome to the Deep Dive. Get ready to explore a topic that sits right at the intersection of personal identity, societal norms, and some really challenging ideas about who we are and who we can be. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a stack of material you sent in articles, research, transcripts, all grappling with the complex and, let's be honest, often controversial idea of transracialism.
It's a concept that definitely sparks strong reactions, yeah. And our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack the different perspectives presented in these sources. We want to understand the arguments being made, look at the surprising parallels, and also the really crucial distinctions they draw between changing one's perceived race and other forms of identity transition, especially, gender.
Exactly. We'll look at what science says and maybe more importantly, what it doesn't say about race, how society kind of defines and polices identity boundaries. And we'll hear from some people who have publicly navigated these really complex questions. It's a heavy but fascinating area, and we're here to guide you through the information. So let's unpack this.
Okay, so let's start by grounding ourselves, maybe, in how the sources define the key terms, race and culture. Because how we understand those words really shapes everything else, doesn't it? What stands out immediately, I think, is that the sources discuss race less as a fixed biological reality and much more as a social construct.
Hmm.
There's one researcher, Professor C. Loring Brace, who makes a really interesting point here. He argues that biological characteristics we often link to race, things like skin color or hair shape, they're actually distributed across the planet on a gradient, a cline, he calls it.
Right, like they change gradually with geography.
Precisely. Think of it less like distinct boxes and more like colors blending into each other on a spectrum. And he notes that other biological traits, like ABO blood types, they distribute totally differently across populations. So, according to this view from the sources, race isn't some pure biological fact. It's more a product of our perceptions and how societies decide to group people.
Right, and the sources remind us that historically some anthropologists actually tried to, use biology.
To argue for inferiority, yeah.
Exactly. To argue for the inferiority of certain groups, sometimes tying into awful movements like eugenics. But then you had figures like Franz Boas pushing back hard against that, emphasizing the huge amount of variation within any given population group.
Which really reinforces that idea, doesn't it? That race is less about strict biology and maybe more about how society decides to slice things up.
Okay, so that's race, as presented in the sources. What about culture? They offer a few different ways to think about it. You have those early ideas like Edward Tyler's. He used culture almost universally to contrast with a state of nature, which, unfortunately led to these hierarchical ideas of civilized versus uncivilized.
Yeah, you can see how that gets problematic really quickly.
Totally. But other sources look at culture differently, linking it to things like consumption, leisure activities, class, or, like Raymond Williams suggested, thinking of it as either aesthetic development, a particular way of life, or artistic activity. Lots of angles.
And when you look at something like the culture of the United States, the sources describe it as this classic melting pot, right? Blending foundational Western influences with African, indigenous, Asian, and other immigrant cultures. And that creates all these diverse regional flavors and ethnic groups. Ethnicity itself is debated too in the sources, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Is it something ancient and fixed, the primordialist view, or is it something that groups and societies actually construct and assign rules to? That's the constructivist idea.
The sources seem to present arguments for both, but that social construct view seems pretty prominent, just like with race.
So with that background on how the sources define and think about race and culture largely as social constructs, often debated, kind of fluid, they then introduce this concept of transracialism,
Hmm.
which is generally understood as identifying with a race other than the one you're assigned at birth. And sometimes that even involves physical changes or presentation. And here's where they immediately bring into conversation with transgender identity.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is how Rogers Brubaker's work, which is highlighted in the sources, uses the transgender experience as a kind of lens, a way to think about the possibility of fluidity in racial identification. He outlines these different types of trans moves.
Yeah.
There's the trans of migration, where you might move entirely from one category to another, maybe with physical or legal changes.
Okay.
Then there's the trans of between, where you identify with reference to two categories, maybe not fully belonging to either, and the trans of beyond, which is positioning yourself outside established categories altogether.
That's actually a helpful framework for thinking about identity transitions generally, isn't it?
It is. But the sources immediately pivot to note a huge difference: the social reception.
Right. Transgender identity claims, particularly in recent decades, have increasingly been framed and gained traction really as a civil rights issue, a response to oppression, a demand for recognition.
Exactly. But claims to change racial identity, whether we're talking about the multiracial movement navigating multiple identities or, more controversial cases like Rachel Dolezal, those have been much harder for society to frame as a civil rights issue. In fact, the sources note these claims have often been criticized, sometimes quite strongly, for potentially undermining existing racial justice efforts.
And there's another key distinction the sources point out.
Yeah.
Right. It's about how subjective feelings are understood and, well, validated.
Yes. They suggest that while gender identity is seen as this deeply subjective inner essence, its growing social legitimacy is often linked, maybe implicitly, to the idea that there might be some underlying objective factors.
Like biological factors.
Perhaps biological, yeah, maybe factors about the body, even if those factors aren't fully understood or visible yet. This potential grounding seems to help validate the subjective feeling for many people.
But racial identity.
Different story, according to the sources. They argue that despite the scientific consensus that race is largely a social construct, it's still widely understood by society as unchanging, unchosen, and primarily based on ancestry, even with increasing awareness of mixed heritage.
So that subjective feeling of identifying differently, it just doesn't get the same kind of societal validation.
Yeah.
Because race is held onto as this fixed external thing.
That seems to be the argument presented. Which brings us to a really interesting point the sources make about identity being constructed or expressed through practices and performances. This idea, sometimes called the performative turn, it's much more readily accepted when we talk about gender studies than when we talk about studies of race and ethnicity.
And why is that, according to the sources?
Well, they suggest it's because applying this idea of performance to race directly challenges the deep-seated kind of essentialist understanding of race that many people hold on to, even people who consider themselves progressive.
Right. The idea that race is just there, fundamentally unchangeable.
Exactly. And this is where concerns about appropriation and exploitation really come into play, particularly when someone socially defined as white performs what's seen as a socially recognizable Black identity. And the sources highlight the stark irony here, perhaps in a reversal of historical patterns, where white culture was maybe seen as the standard.
Okay.
Today, Black identity is often far more closely policed than white identity.
That's a powerful point. And the sources give us some really stark examples of this policing, the whole Dolezal affair, for instance. That's presented as the incident that really wrenched transracial into the public conversation, sparking these incredibly heated debates about deception, authenticity.
But the sources look beyond just her specific case. They try to link the persistence of this racial essentialism, this belief in fixed race, to the brutal reality of racial oppression and violence against Black bodies.
Yeah, they cite the legal scholar Jody Armour making this absolutely critical point. Someone like Michael Brown couldn't be transracial because his Black body was perceived and targeted in a specific life-threatening way by society.
It's a devastating point. And the sources use the horrifying Charleston Church massacre as another example, underlining how race remains, tragically, a catalyst for tragedy for Black individuals, regardless of how anyone feels or identifies internally.
And it's important to note, too, as the sources do, that the transracial adoption community, they strongly rejected applying the term transracial in the way it was used around Dolezal.
Right. Their concern for decades has been about transracial adoptees potentially losing their authentic racial identity without proper support systems. So in their view, Dolezal's case kind of embodied the very danger they were trying to prevent.
Okay, let's maybe zoom in on some personal accounts and specific examples from the sources.
Yeah.
They really bring these complexities to life. There's the story of that Reddit user from the biracial community. This person described identifying deeply with Japanese culture since childhood, using makeup and hair dye to look more Asian, feeling happy when people perceive them that way, feeling accepted by their Asian friends. But there's also this profound sadness.
That they could never actually be Japanese.
Exactly. Wishing they could choose their race, feeling like a closeted trace, as they put it. They articulate this deep desire for their chosen identity to be seen as their true self, and they linked this feeling back to being bullied in the past.
Yeah.
It really highlights that intense subjective feeling.
And then you have the very high-profile case of Martina Big, the German model who underwent this really expensive physical transformation from white to Black.
Yeah, using tanning injections, multiple surgeries.
Yeah.
The sources mentioned it cost over 80,000 euro.
She explicitly states she feels Black inside, describes her body as just a shell she can change. And her experience really underscores that tension between physical attempts at transformation and how society perceives you. The sources note she even had issues with her passport because German authorities apparently updated it to include both white and black pictures, which caused confusion when she traveled.
Wow.
She says most negative comments don't bother her, that she focuses on living her dream, but it just shows the friction.
These examples are so telling. And the sources even get into variations within perceived racial groups, like colorism within black communities.
Yeah, citing the historical brown paper bag club.
Right, where only light-skinned black people were allowed entry. It shows how even within a category, identity can be policed based on appearance.
Exactly. And the example of albino black people, like the reggae artist Yellow Man, that's another powerful illustration presented.
How so?
Well, these are individuals who, due to lacking melanin, are paler than many white people, yet they're still considered black by society. It really challenges the idea that identity is solely about skin color, doesn't it?
It does. It links back to that idea of race being about social rules and perception, not just pigment.
And speaking of pigment, the sources briefly touch on melanin itself, just noting it's an aggregate of molecules, eumelanin being the most common, deficient in albinism. And they mention how hair characteristics also vary by what's typically associated with racial ancestry, like diameter, cross-section shape, and how hairstyles themselves carry huge cultural significance.
It reminds you that while biology provides the variation, it's society that assigns meaning and categories to those variations.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. What about the different arguments swirling around this topic as presented in the sources?
Well, there's a philosophical perspective mentioned from someone named Tell, who considers the arguments against transracialism.
Okay.
Tell suggests that if the concern is that only some people can cross racial boundaries, maybe implying it's easier for lighter-skinned individuals to move toward whiteness, or vice versa, or for white people to claim black identity, then the logical solution, Tell argues, isn't necessarily to ban all such identity claims, but maybe to ask how we could make all transitions possible for the sake of equity.
That's certainly a provocative idea presented there. It flips the script.
Yeah, it definitely turns the argument on its head. And speaking of provocation, another argument presented is that if moving from white to black is called white privilege.
Implying it's an assertion leveraging unearned advantage.
Right. Then perhaps staying white is more of a white privilege, suggesting the critique doesn't necessarily dismantle the idea of transition itself, but highlights the power dynamics involved.
Interesting. And they draw a parallel.
They too. A parallel is drawn to transgender identity, suggesting that if white to black transition can be viewed through the lens of white privilege, then maybe male to female transition could similarly be viewed through the lens of male privilege, given societal hierarchies. Again, these are arguments from the sources for you to consider, not our endorsements.
Understood. The sources also touch on broader points about the roots of discrimination itself. One perspective suggests discrimination stems from a kind of fundamental human tendency to dislike difference. A dislike that gets amplified when negative qualities are attributed to those who are seen as different.
And there was some research cited too, right, about schools.
Yeah, suggesting that while more ethnic diversity in schools can be beneficial, it can sometimes correlate with more racism if the interactions kids have are primarily negative. It implies that positive, meaningful interactions are crucial for reducing prejudice, which kind of challenges the simple idea that just having empathy or understanding others is automatically enough to eliminate racism. Negative experiences, it seems, can actively breed intolerance.
That's a sobering point. And finally, the sources connect this whole conversation to larger societal anxieties about race and culture.
Like the Great Replacement theory.
Exactly. They describe it as this xenophobic and manipulative idea falsely claiming that non-white immigrants have fundamentally different values and are actively trying to erase white culture.
And while the sources clearly dismiss this as manipulative and false, its existence highlights that these fears about the stability, the purity, the boundaries of racial and cultural groups, are present in society and can be, easily exploited.
Okay, so, wow. Taking a step back, after wading through all of this material, what does this deep dive really reveal? It shows us that transracialism is clearly a deeply debated, incredibly complex concept, and it fundamentally challenges how we typically understand race, identity, and belonging.
It really forces us to hold two seemingly conflicting ideas in our minds at once, doesn't it? On one hand, you have the scientific consensus from the sources that race is largely a social construct.
Right.
But on the other hand, you have the undeniable social reality that racial categories are deeply ingrained, and they lead to very real experiences of oppression and discrimination, particularly, as the sources emphasize, for Black individuals.
The sources really highlight this fascinating tension.
Yeah.
You have this growing cultural acceptance, maybe, of subjective identity claims and personal transformation. We see it more clearly with gender bumping up against this persistent, intense policing of racial boundaries.
Especially directed towards those who try to identify as Black.
Exactly.
And we've seen through the personal stories and examples like Martina Big or the Reddit user how individual desire and attempts at physical change interact with societal perception and the heavy weight of historical context. The sources suggest that yes, the idea of fixed ancestry-based race is weakening somewhat, and increasing recognition of mixed heritage does seem to create more space for choice and affiliation for some people.
Huh.
But the ability to simply choose or perform a racial identity remains incredibly controversial. It faces intense scrutiny, often tied to these very legitimate fears of appropriation or the erasure of the lived experience of racial oppression.
And that comparison to transgenderism throughout the sources. It offers crucial insights into why these different identity claims are received so differently by society.
Yeah, touching on ideas of privilege, social acceptance, and that really complex interplay between how someone feels inside and what society perceives as objective factors, or maybe hold on to as objective.
Ultimately, navigating these sources reveals a landscape where the biological facts of human variation, the powerful social and historical construction of race, and individual experiences of identity are all in this dynamic, often conflicting tension.
It's
A lot to process.
It really is.
And it leaves you, the listener, with a really challenging question to mull over based on everything we've just explored. In a world where the science, according to these sources, points to race being more of a fluid social construct than a fixed biological reality, yet society continues to rigidly organize itself around racial categories with very real and often brutal consequences. What does it truly mean to claim a racial identity?
And perhaps even more pointedly, who gets to decide if that claim is considered valid?